and the papacy. Start right here. Anyone who has a passing familiarity with the Reformation history knows something about how this story ends. Martin Luther is declared an obstinate heretic and excommunicated by the Pope. He is declared an outlaw by the German government with the expectation that he will be captured and executed for heresy. Luther, by this point, has made his own break with the papacy and has already publicly declared the Pope to be the Antichrist, and Rome to be the apocalyptic Babylon of the book of Revelation, the place of cruel, demonic tyranny that shackled Christian consciences and destroyed true Christian liberty. We will look today at the question, how did this happen? Might anything have been done to avoid this split? And what were the consequences of this for the development of a new Protestant understanding of the Church? One, medieval views of papal authority. There's an image of Pope Innocent III, maybe the most powerful pope in the Middle Ages. The foundations of papal authority. When we state correctly that Luther rejected the medieval view of the Pope's authority, we beg an important question: what exactly was the medieval view of the Pope's authority? Well, we're not even a few minutes into this lecture, and we've already fallen into a trap, because like most things in the Middle Ages, the answer is a little bit complicated. In the next few minutes, I will try to sketch out the debates over papal authority in the Middle Ages and attempt to situate that Luther's position in the middle of that debate. First, a few essentials for those of you who don't have a whole lot of background in the issue of the Roman Catholic Church's understanding of its own authority and the authority of the Pope. According to church teaching, the Pope essentially derives his status from his position as Bishop of Rome. According to Catholic teaching, the Apostle Peter moved to Rome some decades before his death, where he led the first church in Rome, becoming its first bishop. He then passed on the authority that had been given him by Jesus to his successors, the future bishops of Rome, known as popes from the term papa, which means father, through the centuries up until the current pope today. The Catholic Church cites two key biblical passages to support the claim to papal power. The first comes from the 15th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew. Following Peter's famous confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus says this. 15th. Did I write 16th? I think it's the 15th chapter. "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The second comes from an account in the 21st chapter of the Gospel according to John, which recounts a meeting between Jesus and his disciples on a beach after the resurrection. In that encounter, Jesus tells Peter, "Feed my sheep." In the Catholic tradition, the first text gives the Pope administrative authority over the Church. This comes in three forms. The first form is essentially executive. The Pope has ultimate authority over personnel, the authority to make appointments to church offices, to remove office holders, those are the two big ones. And this control over personnel, though, extends to a general power of administrative oversight over the various functions of the church. Its offices, fiscal, diplomatic, military, all of those offices ultimately fall under his authority. The second authority is judicial. Over the centuries, the church developed a complex legal code, which we call canon law, to adjudicate all manner of issues. Most of these issues were dealt with in diaconal or episcopal courts of bishops or archdeacons. But it was always possible to appeal to Rome. And the final court of appeal, so to speak, was the Pope. The power to declare who or who was not a member of the church could be considered a subset of the judicial function. This is the main meaning of the power mentioned here in the 15th chapter of Matthew. This idea of loosening and binding. It involves the power to declare someone forgiven or not forgiven, to declare someone a member in good standing of the church, or excommunicated. And although excommunication is really a judicial action and forgiveness of sins is really a subset of the pastoral function, at the top of it all, regardless, stands the Pope, who delegates his authority if he chooses, or reserves it for himself at his own discretion. Finally, the Pope has a kind of legislative authority, the authority to issue decrees. These issues could be guidance on a number of matters with respect to belief, practice, policy, procedure, morals. These decrees are often incorporated then into canon law, which had the effect of validating their normative character. The second text from John 21, "Feed my sheep," underscores the Pope's pastoral authority, including, under that subset, his teaching authority. By teaching authority, the Pope had the power to shape doctrine, define the parameters of the faith, and to interpret the scriptures. Finally, and most importantly, I think probably, for people in the Middle Ages, the Pope was considered the vicar of Christ on earth, his personal representative, ruling in his place during the absence of Christ in heaven. This created an aura of divine majesty that surrounded the person of the Pope. He was viewed with a kind of awe and reverence by the Catholic faithful. And this, I think, more than any abstract assent to the formal authority of the Pope, created an attitude of deference and obedience towards the Pope among medieval Catholics, not least of whom was Martin Luther. Limits of papal power. This raises the question whether the power of the Pope was limited in any way. Did he have to share power? Was he required to cooperate? Could he be checked by anyone or any institution or any authority besides God himself? On a practical level, of course, the answer is yes. The medieval papacy was a kind of monarchy, and even the most powerful absolute monarchy has found itself hemmed in multiple ways. By competing factions, by the powerful and wealthy who support the monarch needs, by independent-minded bureaucrats, by limited resources. The medieval papacy was no different in this respect, on a practical level. But on a level of principle, was it believed that the Pope's power was limited? Here's where the discussion gets a little bit complicated. The Middle Ages saw a vigorous debate on the authority of the Pope, both on a theoretical and a practical level. The richest source for this debate is to be found among the jurists, or canon lawyers, the people who collected, debated, and implemented and interpreted canon law, the vast body of conciliar and papal decrees that were bound together and become what we call canon law, and it becomes the foundation of the church courts. This is an example of Gratian's Decretum. Excuse me. Here's one of the papal decrees in the center, just like we saw last week with the Bible, with the text in the center and the gloss all the way around. Right in the center is a papal decree, and then all around there is the jurist Gratian, the most famous jurist of the High Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, and he's writing his commentary all around it. He's bringing together all sorts of decrees and dictates and various documents that have been produced by councils and popes, and trying to unite them into a body of law that can be interpreted and implemented by church courts. And of course, all in here is interpretation and debate about the meaning of these texts and how they should be implemented. Much of the canon law was administrative. in that it dealt with the authority and responsibility of various church offices. Like modern legal scholars, however, medieval canon lawyers did not agree with each other on the meaning of these texts. First, they disagreed on the ultimate source of the Pope's power. While most canon lawyers believed that the Pope's authority comes directly from God, not all did. Some believed that it derived from the community of all Christians, and that the Pope only exercised the authority that was granted to him by that community. Second, canon lawyers disagreed whether the Pope shared authority with other church officials, or if he had all of it contained in himself, that then he could delegate out as he chose or reserve as he chose. Some held that the authority inhered not in the popes alone, but in the Pope together with the council, the church council, the general council of the church, right? Or some said the Pope together with the cardinals, or some said the Pope together with the bishops. Some argued that the primary responsibility for deciding articles of faith lay with the general council of the church, because it expressed the universality of the church more completely than did the Pope, who was only one man. Some believed that the Pope was required to act in accordance with the decrees of church councils. Some also applied what we call corporation theory to the papacy. The medieval church was made up of bodies of people, heads and members. The monastery with the abbot, the bishop with the cathedral canons. And so in the Middle Ages, the church is really the institution that develops what we call corporation law. How those bodies interact with the general church and how members of those bodies interact with each other. This is a complicated sort of subset of medieval canon law, but of particularly importance for our discussion is the relationship in medieval canon law between the head and the members of corporations. And suffice it to say that it was generally stipulated that they shared power. Okay, just cut to the bottom of it. They shared power, the head and the members, in relatively complex ways. Would this not then mean that the Pope had to share power with other leaders of the church? Some suggested yes. Others said no. Others believed that the Pope had what they called plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power, that he was above all human law, that he had absolute authority in all areas of the church, ruling alone and possessing all the powers of Christ on earth, even up to the power to dispense with the precepts of the Bible, as long as they did not thereby contravene a stated article of faith. What else did they disagree on? Well, they disagreed on the conditions under which or whether a wicked pope could be disciplined. And this is going to be important for our discussion with Martin Luther. There was a general consensus that the Pope was immune from human judgments, unless he should deviate from the faith. That was always the key term. Unless he should deviate from the faith. Well, what did that mean? For some, it meant that he had to publicly ascribe to a known heresy. For others, it could be his private opinions. For others, it could be severe public sin that scandalized the faithful. That would be the most broad interpretation, not held very commonly, but held by some. Well, that raises a question then, how could you try and remove a pope from power, since he was the final court of appeal and superior to everybody? For some, you could not. The answer was simply that the pope self-deposes in a case of heresy. By embracing heresy, he simply ceases to become the pope. But this doesn't help you very much in identifying the actual mechanism you would use to remove him under those circumstances, right? How would you then actually get him out? Doesn't really answer that question. Others said that you could try a pope if he deviated from the faith. Who would do it, though? Maybe a general council, some suggested. maybe the canons, some suggested. Maybe the cardinals, some suggested. Maybe even in an emergency, the emperor himself could depose a pope, because back in the dark days of the papacy in the 800s and 900s, emperors did depose popes, like in actual fact. So that happened on more than one occasion. So maybe that was another option. You could bring the secular authority in to do the job. But let's keep in mind then this diversity of opinions in the Middle Ages on the powers of the Pope and the conditions under which he might be disciplined or ignored or removed, and by whom. It will help us then understand how Luther, for such a long time, was able to cling to the view that his severe, and let's say it was severe, his severe criticism of the Pope and his demand that the Pope be brought to account was not an attack on the Church per se. Luther maintained this for a very long time, this position. Rather, he was able to assert that he was operating within a minority strain of Catholic jurisprudence on the issue of papal authority and accountability. Okay, so we're going to separate out the legal and judicial process that the Catholic Church goes through to remove Luther, and the personal process that Luther goes through to essentially disassociate himself from the Catholic Church. We'll start with the legal and judicial process. Separation of the Catholic Church from Luther. This is Cardinal Cajetan. He's going to come back a number of times, so keep an eye on him. Luther and the Catholic Church separated from themselves consciously and decisively, and the Church's separation was naturally formal, institutional, judicial. Luther's was internal and personal, but not private, because he is an international figure at this point, so he's going through this process in some ways also very publicly. I'll deal with each of them in turn. The papacy became aware of the Luther affair, as it was called, in early 1518. During the 1518 Imperial German Diet, a German Diet is a meeting of the main political powers of the sprawling Holy Roman Empire, which includes Germany and some other bits of other Central European states. And they come together every year or so to discuss matters of the empire. They have some loose legislative functions. They were meeting in the city of Augsburg in 1518. And in April 1518, Pope Leo X designated this man, Cardinal Cajetan, to act as papal legate and try to resolve the Luther affair. By late spring, in 1518, the papal court had prepared a summons for Luther to come to Rome and answer for his views. By early August, the Church had persuaded the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Maximilian, to take its side against Luther. And in a letter to the Pope, Maximilian promises to enforce any church judgments against Luther. Meanwhile, a furious diplomatic scramble is taking place between the papal representatives, Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, and imperial officials over the future of Luther's trial. Luther and Frederick wanted a debate, an academic debate with Cajetan, and a trial, if there were going to be a trial, to take place on German soil. They thought the outcome would be a little more favorable for Luther than if he was packed off to Rome, where his fate was pretty much a foregone conclusion. The papacy wanted no debate between Luther and Cajetan, simply a recantation by Luther, or, failing that, Luther's swift deportation to Rome. Cajetan is caught between two powerful forces and makes contradictory guarantees to both. So when Luther arrives in Augsburg, he begins a series of meetings with Cajetan in October 1518. Luther is going to be disappointed that Cajetan is not willing to engage in an academic debate with him over his 95 Theses. On the other hand, he did not issue a verdict against Luther, as he had been told to by the Pope. And he doesn't have Luther arrested because he promised Frederick the Wise, Luther's prince, that he wouldn't have him arrested. So he's trying to negotiate here a very difficult situation. Well, after a series 3 mutually unsatisfying meetings between Luther and Cajetan, to cut to the chase, Luther and his supporters become increasingly nervous about the environment inside Augsburg. And so on the night of October 20th, Luther escapes through a back door in the city walls of Augsburg and rides off into the night. One of these dramatic moments in Luther's life. Cajetan's position had indeed hardened. He was right about that. And by the end of October 1518, he is writing to Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, urging him to either send him to Rome for trial, or barring that, at least expel him from electoral Saxony so someone else can get a hold of him and send him off for trial. By the end of 1518, though, December 1518, Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, has made his decision. He wrote Cajetan refusing to send Luther out, and he is determined, for reasons that we never fully understand, to take his position with his troublesome but now internationally famous university professor. For the moment, wouldn't be the first time he will have to decide what to do with a troublesome university professor. So won't be the last either, I suspect. For the moment, though, at least Luther was safe.
Is that why we had tenure?
That's why I like tenure. I'm not that troublesome, really. While the papacy it continued to engage in low-scale negotiations with Frederick to secure the recantation or deportation of Luther, the issue had moved on to a university level. The judgment of a university theology faculty regarding the heresy or orthodoxy of someone's views was an important element in the decision process to ultimately condemn someone of heresy or not. So the opponents of Luther were working very hard to secure the judgment of a theology faculty against him. One of Luther's chief early opponents, University of Ingolstadt theology professor Johannes Eck, seen there, repurposed a debate that he was having with another one of Luther's colleagues, whose name was Andreas Bodenstein from Karlstadt. He doesn't really figure into our story today, but he will in week 4. We're going to have a university debate at the University of Leipzig, and he persuades Luther to come and debate with him as well, and he hopes to ensnare Luther in that debate. We'll get back to this debate again a little later on when we talk about Luther's side of things. The debate took place between June 27th and July 14th, 1518. To Eck's disappointment, the Leipzig theology faculty refused to issue a judgment against Luther. However, based on transcripts from the debate, 2 other theology faculties agreed to condemn Luther's positions as heretical. These are the theological faculties of Cologne and the Louvain. The pendulum was now swinging by the middle of 1519 against Luther. Changes in the political environment also made things more unstable for Luther towards the end of 1519. The Pope had been surprisingly solicitous of Frederick the Wise during this whole affair for 2 reasons. First, the Pope during the Diet of Augsburg had wanted the Diet to authorize a contribution for a crusade against the Turks. And Frederick the Wise is an important prince of the empire. The Pope did not want to alienate him. Second, the Emperor Maximilian died in January 1519, and the Pope needed Frederick's assistance because he was one of the 7 electors who would elect the next emperor. And the Pope wanted to make sure, excuse me, gonna die, okay, all right. The Pope wanted to make sure, for very complicated reasons, that Francis I, the newly crowned King of France, was not going to also be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I wanted that title. So he needed all of the major princes of the empire on his side to stop Francis I from winning that election, and he needed the help also then of Frederick the Wise. Well, by June 1519, the Diet was over. He didn't need Frederick the Wise's help on the Turkish affair anymore. And in that month also, a new emperor was elected, Emperor Charles V, who's the grandson of Maximilian. And so Frederick is no longer needed. And the case against Luther could begin in earnest. In January 1520, Luther's case is reopened in Rome, and by February, commissions are at work putting together documents demonstrating his heresy. Rome is here preparing a formal denunciation against Luther by early 1520. By the end of May, the papal bull of excommunication, Exsurge Domine, was prepared, and by June 1st, 1520, it passed with the final vote of cardinals in the consistory. That is the published bull of excommunication. He's not excommunicated in this bull, but he's threatened with excommunication in this. A bull is an official papal document with a seal on it. That's what a bull is. It's an official papal document with a seal on it. The text of the bull, this one here, condemned the 41 errors that had been found in Luther's writing, many of them dealing with penance and indulgences, but also with papal and conciliar authority. It demanded his recantation within 60 days of its publication in Luther's own territory of Electoral Saxony. The Pope's representatives fan out north, publishing the bull in cities across Germany, and by October 11th, it had reached Wittenberg. So at that point, Luther has 60 days to recant, beginning October 11th, 1520. The event set off another series of intense negotiations between Frederick and the emperor and the representatives of the Pope. Frederick continued to refuse to turn Luther over and managed to secure a meeting in the upcoming Diet of Worms between Luther and the representatives of the Pope in the presence of the emperor. The exact nature of this meeting, however, retained a kind of studied ambiguity. Was it a debate? Was it a trial? Was it simply an opportunity to offer Luther a venue for recantation? No one could exactly say what it was because no one could agree on what it was. Finally, on December 10th, 1520, the last day granted for Martin Luther to respond to the summons, Luther, together with a flock of students, goes outside the Wittenberg town walls, sets a bonfire alight, and throws the papal bull into the flames. And then they throw in some other books of canon law and other Catholic texts for good measure. So that was Luther's public statement about what he was going to do with respect to recantation. All right, on January 3rd, 1521, Luther was formally excommunicated by the Catholic Church for heresy. In the papal bull, Decet Romanum Pontificum. Bulls are named after the first two or three letters, first two or three words of the bull. So it's always you take the first two or three words of the bull, and that becomes the title of it. So, it's still true today. Papal encyclicals and so forth are named after the first two or three words of that encyclical in Latin. Nevertheless, to secure secular punishment for Luther, the church was, because the church doesn't have punitive authority, right? The church has the right to declare someone a heretic. It technically doesn't have the right to carry out coercive punishments against somebody. That resides with the secular authority. The church has to turn that person over to the secular authority for that public execution, because heresy in the Middle Ages and the early modern world in all European countries is illegal. Right? It's not only a violation of church law, it's a violation of secular law. It's illegal to be a heretic. So once the church has declared you a heretic, the church can't burn you, right? That's kind of a myth, right? The church can't burn you. The church or punish you or coerce you in any way. The church has to turn you over to the secular authority. They can carry out the punishment. So he's been declared a heretic. It's illegal to be a heretic. Now the government can carry out that punishment. Well, you have to get the government to do that, right? For the church would need the government to agree to carry out the sentence. For that to happen, the church had to concede to this meeting at the Diet of Worms, which it did not want to do. But it could take confidence that the newly elected emperor, Charles V, was a staunch Catholic and had no interest in tolerating heresy. So, on March 5th, he sent a letter citing Luther, Charles did, to the Diet of Worms, promising him safe conduct. There's a woodcut from the 16th century of the Diet of Worms. There's Charles there on the throne and Luther with his books and a bunch of other imperial counselors surrounding him in this discussion. Luther arrived in Worms on April 16th, and over the next 2 days met twice with Luther's representatives in the presence of the emperor and the chief princes of the empire. Luther realized that he would not be allowed to publicly debate his positions, deeply disappointing to him. He's pressed to renounce his views, and he gives his famous "Here I Stand" speech, if you're aware of it, if you know what that is. We can talk about that later if you're interested. Negotiations continued in a desultory kind of way for the next few weeks. Then on April 26, 1521, Luther again becomes nervous that the situation in Worms is deteriorating. He leaves the city and is captured, or pseudo-captured, by a number of his prince's representatives and spirited off to safety in one of Prince Frederick the Wise's castles of Wartburg, where he's kept safe for the next 18 months. Meanwhile, we're wrapping this part up. The final pieces against Luther were falling into place. On May 8th, 1521, Charles puts Luther under the imperial ban. And on May 26th, he publishes the so-called Edict of Worms, which, among other things, declared Luther a public, obstinate heretic and an outlaw of the empire. He would, in fact, remain an outlaw of the empire for the rest of his life, liable to be captured and hauled off for execution by any citizen of the empire. Anyone had the right to capture him and haul him off to the authorities for execution. He was a public outlaw of the empire for the rest of his life, and that's what would have happened to him should he leave his safe haven of electoral Saxony, which he never did again for the rest of his life. He stayed there until his death. Well, we're on to Luther now. So, gradual dissolution, the separation of Luther from the Roman Church. There's another early image of Luther still in his cowl and his tonsure, looking very rugged. Luther under the papacy. How are you feeling? We're about halfway, we're in part 2, break, keep going? Keep going. Some people say keep going. Okay. We'll go a little farther and then take a little break. Okay. Under the papacy, looking back on his days before the Reformation, Luther remarks that he was an arch-papist, a super-papist. Further, he would state that he was so drunk, yes, submerged in the Pope's dogmas, that I would have been ready to murder all who would have taken away but a syllable from obedience to the Pope. That's what he said. These statements, however, were made decades after the events, long after the final break with Rome, so Luther may have had some motives to magnify the shift, to intensify the drama of it. Nevertheless, in his life as a monk, Luther always showed respect for the church hierarchy, including the Pope, and showed a particular aversion for heresy. Missing, interestingly enough, in his pre-Reformation writings are any explicit endorsements of papal power or expressions of zealously pro-papal sentiments. A little curious, it would seem, for a supposed arch-papist. Why didn't he ever talk about that in his pre-Reformation writings? Could he have harbored some doubts? Some carefully muted resentments? The question hangs open. Sorry about that. We lack evidence to know for certain. But there is something curious about that. Luther, in fact, insisted during the controversy over the 95 Theses, and also in retrospect, that he had never intended to make an issue of papal authority. The controversy in his mind was never supposed to be about papal authority. By rejecting the power of the Pope over, let's say, souls in purgatory, which he did in the 95 Theses controversy, or his power to set aside all works of satisfaction not imposed by the Church in the confessional, something also from the 95 Theses controversy. That shows up in the initial lecture if you want to go back and look at those controversial points. Luther did not believe at the time that he was attacking the traditional authorities of the Pope. Even though he said the Pope didn't have the power to do these things, he didn't see himself as attacking the authority of the Pope. Why? Instead, in his mind, he was only attacking the erroneous innovations that certain scholastic theologians had attributed to the Pope in later years, in the Middle Ages. Now, these are things which he, as a professor of a theology faculty, was well within his rights to debate. He believed. Now, Luther's earliest Catholic opponents saw things entirely differently. From the outset, they largely shunted aside the indulgence controversy. That was just a minor issue for them. They took aim directly at Luther's alleged assault on papal power. That was the nub of the issue for them. It wasn't about indulgences. Many of them didn't even like indulgences. Many of them were also skeptical of indulgences. The problem for them was that in attacking indulgences, Luther seemed to be threatening papal power. And that's the issue that they relentlessly went after him on. This caused Luther to reevaluate his position on the nature of religious authority in general, and the authority of the papacy in particular. Maybe we'll do one more section here and then take a quick break. Oop, I went the wrong way. Oh, I went the right way. All right, Cardinal Cajetan has come back. Here he is again. When Luther met Cajetan in Augsburg, he met a fierce defender of papal authority. Cajetan held that the Pope ruled by divine right alone, that his power came unmediated by any other church body like a council, but rather that all authority in the church was delegated to those bodies by the Pope alone. The Pope's decrees, when made deliberatively, were to be considered without error. Okay, so it's not surprising that Cajetan didn't really want to even talk about indulgences per se, but rather about Luther's view of papal authority. He produced a papal decree from 1343 that formed the foundation of the Pope's ability to issue indulgences and demanded to know Luther's response. Was it valid? Luther was forced to admit that he considered the Pope's decree to be wrong. He essentially argued that the Pope's decrees should be respected if they are consistent with the Scriptures, but that they are only truly binding if they are affirmed by a church council, which this one was not. Cajetan asserted that the Pope was above all the councils, and even above the Scriptures. Obviously, this meeting did not end in agreement. After the break, let's take a quick break now, I think. I'm about halfway through. And we will pick up again with our friend Johannes Eck, and Luther making another step away from the papacy, where he's going to argue that the papacy is really just a human institution. So what do we have, 15 minutes? Is that right? We'll be talking about here in just a minute. So, let's begin. We're at C. Can everyone hear me? I've just got the lapel mic on here. Okay, we're at C. The papacy is at best a human institution. We're moving back to this other important encounter that Luther has after the Cardinal Cajetan encounter in Augsburg. The Leipzig debate with Johannes Eck is going to drive him further away from a commitment to papal authority. Meanwhile, while Eck was preparing for the Leipzig debate mentioned above, like Cajetan, he zeroed in on a statement that Luther made about papal authority in an explanation that he published on the 95 Theses. To the effect, Luther says that the Roman Church, that is the Pope, was not the head of the whole church in the 6th century. Luther just makes that as a kind of a passing reference. He says that the Roman Church was not the head of the whole church in the 6th century. He's thinking here of the churches of the Greek East that did and do not recognize the authority of the Pope. Eck responds that the Pope was always the head over all the churches all over the world, whether they recognize it or not, because he is the head of the Church of Jesus Christ by divine right as the successor of St. Peter. Again, this forces Luther to clarify his position. And he concludes that the Pope is only head of the Western Church by human right, and in no other way than a king would be the head of a country. And this only over the Western churches that recognize his authority. Now, he says, the Bible commands that we show obedience to our rulers. And so he was willing to obey the Pope on those terms. But the idea of the Pope as a divinely appointed authority over the universal church based on the promises of Christ to St. Peter, that's out the window. Okay. He no longer supports that view. If he ever did, not quite clear. D, papal decrees, even if approved by a general council, can be wrong. But what about the authority of a church council? There had been movements in the past, moments in time, when the authority of the Pope had come under, let's just say, a certain amount of stress. But no one had ever dared to question the authority of a properly constituted church council. Could Eck force Luther during the debate to show himself to be even more the heretic that he really was by forcing him to publicly deny the authority of a properly constituted church council? Eck was certainly going to try, and he found the perfect mechanism to do it. In 1417, the Council of Constance had tried and condemned the Czech reformer Jan Hus. And there's Jan Hus being burned at the stake. It also formally condemned many of his statements, and as you can see, burned him at the stake. It's funny, though, that Hus had seemed to make a number of statements that matched pretty closely with some of the statements that Luther was making. Particularly interesting for Eck was a statement that had been condemned by the Council of Constance, made by Hus, that it was not necessary for salvation to believe that the Roman Church is superior to all other churches. That's what Hus had said. It is not necessary for salvation to believe that the Roman Church is superior to all other churches. And that statement was publicly condemned as heresy by the Council of Constance. Luther, it seems, had been writing the very same thing. And Eck wanted to know what he thought about that statement. Did he believe it or not? Was he going to deny a judgment from a properly constituted church council? Luther spent some time trying to dodge that question. He doesn't want to answer it. Eck is a master debater. He pushes Luther against the wall, figuratively, and demands an answer. And finally, after some hesitation, Luther says that the Council of Constance was wrong. That a church council could be wrong, and that it, like all other things, was subject to the scriptures and needed to be judged by it. Well, that just blew the lid off of everything. Up until now, it was still possible for Luther to present himself and see himself as a loyal son of the church, simply trying to rein in the abusive authority of a pope, whose corruption was facilitated by absolutist papal theories promulgated by theologians of his day that were wrong. He had tried to hold together a bundle of authorities: the church fathers, the councils, the Bible, canon law, good reasoning, hold them all together in a bundle and try to make the case that they were mutually reinforcing. His opponents were very clever, though, in forcing him to abandon these authorities one by one, until all that was left was Scripture alone. Now, Scripture as the ultimate and foundational authority, that was a legitimate medieval Catholic position. You could hold that. And Scripture is the ultimate foundational authority for all matters in church life and practice. You could hold that. Okay. Scripture together with the tradition. Scripture interpreted through the tradition. That's a legitimate medieval position to take. You can take that position. Scripture together with other elements. Okay. Canon law, papal decrees, council, general council decrees, the church fathers, together with other things. That was a legitimate medieval position to take. But just Scripture, the Bible alone, that was the position of heretics. The trajectory, if it had not already been so, now was clear. The papacy is the Antichrist. Was it possible for Luther to take it any further than this? Of course it was. For Luther, it was always possible to take it further, right? So indeed, what becomes a nagging suspicion, a private conviction, eventually breaks forth for Luther in a public declaration. The Pope was that diabolical sign of the last days prophesied in the book of Revelation. Yes, the Pope was the Antichrist himself. The Antichrist is an end times figure mentioned explicitly only in the second letter of John. Well, is it in the third? I can't remember. It's in the second letter of John, sometimes in the singular, sometimes in the plural. The concept is associated with heresy emerging in the final hour. It picks up force, this idea of the Antichrist, when it is attached in the early centuries of the church to the beast described in the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation. And I thought I would read this to you. I did it we're going to read it in the King James because it seems particularly ominous in the King James. So this is the 13th chapter of the Revelation. Notice that the word Antichrist never shows up here. But in the early church, by the 3rd century, they have associated this concept of the Antichrist with the beast in the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise from the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power, and his seat, the dragon is Satan, and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of the life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed by the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake like a dragon. And he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doth great wonders, so that he maketh a fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. And he deceiveth them that dwell on earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image of the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had a power to give life unto images of the beast, and the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should to be killed. And he caused all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or on their forehead, and that no man may buy or sell save that he has the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. I like that, 666. Good King James there. Okay, so that becomes the image in the Middle Ages of the Antichrist. The Antichrist in the Middle Ages takes on a powerful end times form, an agent of Satan, who is usually seen as emerging from within the church to draw away worship from God and attach it to himself. While there was apocalypticism and end time speculation throughout the Middle Ages, it would be fair to say that the atmosphere was particularly charged in the century before the Reformation, and interest in the Antichrist was particularly heightened. In fact, probably the very first book ever to be published in the German language was this, Der Antichrist und die 15 Zeichen vor dem jüngsten Gericht, the Antichrist and the 15 signs before the last judgment. Probably the very first book to be published in German, right before the Gutenberg Bible was published. This is. It was not printed on a printing press, though. It was published as a block book, which was a printing technology that emerged in the decade before the printing press and endured into the 1470s. This is an example of a block book. The block book publishing, each page with text and pictures was carved into a single wood block. Then as many pages were stamped out as necessary. The Antichrist and the 15 signs before the last judgment was published first in the 1440s and was published again in block book format through the 1470s, a testament to the enduring popularity of the theme. This is, by the way, a page on the birth of the Antichrist. And you can see this copy has been colored in, right? And they've got the words here which are carved out, and then the pictures which are carved out with it. It's kind of a transitional technology, sort of like maybe an 8-track tape or something, if anyone remembers those. It kind of that existed a little bit before the printing press and endured into the 1470s, a little bit after the printing press. This 21-page book documents the life of the Antichrist and alerts Christians to the signs of his coming so that they can avoid deceptions and prepare for the end of the world. Martin Luther participated fully in the apocalyptic strain of the later Middle Ages. Luther did not believe that the Reformation was unleashing and inaugurating an enlightened age where true religion would emerge victorious and create a world of peace, harmony, and Christian piety. No. He believed instead that God had set free the gospel at the end of times to provoke a final confrontation with his old enemy, Satan. The more the gospel was preached, the more Satan would rage. And as Satan felt that his end was near, he would unleash his final assault on humanity, bringing as many people down with him as possible. Violence, persecution, conflict, disorder. That, for Luther, would be the marker of the final period of history, the period of the gospel. Although there would certainly be wars and persecutions and social disorder, for Luther, Satan's most diabolical, if you will, technique would be in the last days the sending of the Antichrist, a figure that would rise up within the church itself, that seemed on first glance to resemble Christ, but on closer inspection proved to be exactly the opposite. The Antichrist would promote worship of himself and draw with him as many to perdition as possible before the return of Christ. Devout Christians had been alert to this danger for centuries, but only slowly did the grim horror dawn on Luther. The end times were here. The Antichrist had been unleashed, and it was the Pope himself. Luther comes around to this conclusion haltingly and in stages. And these conclusions are obviously related to the behavior of the popes, but also to the way that the papacy is treating him in his case. These are interrelated. Luther's first mutterings about the Antichrist occur in a private letter around December 1518, when Cajetan has ratcheted up the pressure on Frederick the Wise to deport Luther or send him off for trial. In fact, Luther was so convinced that his time in Saxony was coming to an end, he gave a farewell dinner for all his friends. But Frederick, in the last moment, decides that Luther can stay. But it will be shortly after this dramatic series of events that Luther will confide in a private letter to a friend that the Antichrist was reigning in the court at Rome. Now, he's not comparing him with the Pope yet, right? He's saying the Antichrist is unleashed somewhere in Rome. Luther took another step in March 1519, again in a private letter. This is all still private. The situation was a little less personal. He had been reading papal decrees, preparing for his debate with Johannes Eck, and he had been shocked by the extent to which the decrees seemed arbitrary and not grounded in the Bible. Luther was not a canon lawyer. He didn't like canon lawyers. He didn't like canon law. He was not familiar with it. So the more he read, the more upset he became. Could the Pope, he wonders in the letter, be the Antichrist? In early, still a little bit of distance here, right? In early 1520, Luther read Lorenzo Valla's refutation of the donation of Constantine. Okay. A very minor footnote today, right? But a big deal at the time. The donation of Constantine was a document supposedly from the 4th century in which the Emperor Constantine gives to the Pope authority over the entire Western Roman Empire, to the Pope and to his successors in perpetuity. It was one of the key texts that the popes had used in the Middle Ages to claim various kinds of political power in European kingdoms. It was also a forgery, written about 500 years later, as proven by the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla at the end in the middle of the 15th century, using the most up-to-date linguistic tools of the Renaissance. The manuscript of Valla's refuting the document, however, was not published until 1519, and when Luther read it, he was flabbergasted by the deception. Truly, the Pope's power was built on a fraud. He could scarcely doubt, he confided to a friend, that the Pope is the Antichrist. From this point on, he begins to write much more about what he calls papal tyranny, imposing on Christians of burdensome ceremonies and laws that they can never fulfill, all for the purpose of ruining their consciences and sending them into despair. It was not until August 1520, in his address to the German nobility of the Christian nation, something we talked about last week, that Luther was willing to publicly associate the Pope with the Antichrist. You'll recall from the previous lecture that this treatise, Luther states that the papists insulate themselves from reforming by erecting 3 walls around themselves. The first is that the government can have no role in reforming the church. The second is that only the papacy can interpret the scripture. The third is that only a church council can only be called by the papacy. So that no one can, in fact, question or challenge the Pope. Luther declares that if they do not pull down these walls and allow themselves to be reformed, that they are then a true community of the Antichrist. This is the first public reference that he makes to the Pope as the Antichrist. It would only be fair to note that these remarks, again, reflect a kind of heightened tension in his admittedly constantly tense relationship with the Pope. The bull of excommunication against Luther by this point had been published. It was making its way north through Germany, and people were waiting tensely in Wittenberg at the moment, right, for it to arrive in Wittenberg and for that 60-day period to begin. Luther at this moment, waiting for the bull to arrive, is filled with anxiety, dread, and also a little bit of relief. He feels that the final confrontation now is at his doorstep, and he makes many comments about how he's about to be martyred. His willingness to publicly associate the Pope with the Antichrist reflects, among other things, the very tense conditions that are prevailing in Wittenberg at that moment. All right, the association of the Antichrist and the papacy shows up again in his other very famous August 1520 writing, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. That was called The Pagan Servitude of the Church. Again, he argues that the Pope demands a series of insurmountable requirements that give people bad consciences and drive them to perdition. This becomes a pretty constant refrain that Luther articulates in his opposition to the papacy. He writes, quote, "Unless they lift their own laws and traditions and restore to the churches of Christ the liberty that is theirs, they are guilty of all the souls that perish in this miserable captivity. And the papacy is indeed nothing but the kingdom of Babylon and the true Antichrist." Well, on October 11th, after much waiting, the bull of excommunication against Luther finally arrives in Wittenberg. Luther feels free now to make his complete break with the papacy. That has broken with him. And the title of his book, published the next month, makes that clear. The title of his book, Against the Bull of the Antichrist. I think we pretty much have come to the final moment here, right? You can't go much farther than that. And Luther, in fact, would not look back. You know, if you're looking for the moderation of Luther over time, he says, it was okay, tensions were a little heightened, I was feeling a little emotional. No, you're not going to find that, Luther. Okay, Luther would not look back. And over the years, if possible, his position even hardens. The kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the Antichrist, these were two diametrically opposed powers for Luther. One based on faith, the other on works and meaningless rituals. A person belonged to one, or they belonged to the other. Later in life, as a matter of fact, Luther would work hard to communicate his understanding to the next generation, afraid that they might not have the same hatred of papal depravity that he did, since they did not have to crawl and claw their way up out of it as he had. He was afraid, Luther was, that their views might soften, that they might compromise, that they might fail to discern the presence of the Antichrist on the papal throne. Well, what to make of all this? Right? Certainly talking like this about people of another religious opinion is certainly simply just, we don't do that anymore, right? We save this kind of language for our political opponents, as I could attest by scrolling through my Facebook feed on occasion. The question is this, then: is it possible to separate Luther's other religious insights from his view that the Pope is the Antichrist, the last times figure unleashed in the church to bring people to perdition? Can we chalk it up to some element of his personal experience, to the late medieval environment of apocalypticism that he grew up in? We should also not ignore the fact that the papacy was literally trying to have him killed, to burn his books, to bury his ideas, and to destroy the movement that he had risked his life to start. And Luther, unlike us, lived in an intense state of continual stress, not knowing how all this story was going to turn out. Being in this kind of pressure cooker can create intense emotions and responses, especially for a man like Luther, who was never known for his moderation. Right? He was not. Luther, of course, would insist, if we asked him, that all of his insights are inseparable. Now, he would say that not having known, he would not have known the freedom of faith, if he had not experienced the papal tyranny and its ceremonies. He would not have known the glorious forgiveness of grace. He had not experienced the tyranny of papal teachings about salvation by works. He would have not known the glory of God's kingdom if he had not labored for decades in the kingdom of Satan. If the Pope had not held him down so fast, he would say Christ would not have been able to save him so marvelously. Of course, Luther does not get to control his ideas from the grave, and people are under no obligation to take everything he says as a package. People can and have separated out different elements of Luther's thought and have taken what seems to them right and have left the rest. And I will leave this to all of you to sort out for yourselves. It's not my job. All right, Luther and the church. This is the final section. This will give us a good 20 minutes for questions and answers, it looks like, so that's good. The starkest choice presented by Luther, the Church of Christ or the Church of the Antichrist. Take your pick. This closed down options and room to maneuver and room to compromise. And that was by design. You can't compromise with the Antichrist, for goodness sake, right? And that's the whole point. So for Luther, to an extent, and his followers, the understanding of the church narrows. Oh, by the way, this is the castle doors in Wittenberg, where they've got a bronze doors with the 95, if you really zoomed in closely there, you would see the 95 Theses are there on the bronze doors. Castle Church of Wittenberg, and you can go read those 95 Theses there. So relatively, in some ways, Luther bequeaths to the Protestant church a relatively narrow understanding of the church. It was us, faithful Lutherans, upholders of the true theology of Martin Luther, against the poisonous heresies of the Roman Antichrist, and also against all the schismatic heretics who have spun off from us. Sacramentarians, Anabaptists, Calvinists, all you Presbyterians out there. You believe in the real bodily presence of Jesus Christ in the elements of the Eucharist? If not, you are an enemy of God and an agent of the devil. No, it's true. No, it's true. He would say that without a doubt. You do not believe in the real presence, like you, all you Presbyterians out there. You do not believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. This is number 4. This is lecture 4. You are an enemy of God and an agent of the devil. He would swear to that. He would swear to that. So in many ways, there was a narrowing going on here. There was a narrowing. But there's also a broadening strain within Luther's thought as well that emerges out of Luther's struggle with the papacy. This strain offers a different way to approach Luther's understanding of what constitutes the church. The church for Luther cannot be a building. It cannot be a human institution. It certainly cannot be a hierarchy of church leaders, the popes, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests. The human institution with its buildings and its institutions and its leaders and its rulers, right, had cut him off. And, of course, he sees that as revealing that they are, in fact, agents of the devil. For Luther, then, the church can only be seen by faith because it is an invisible, universal communion of saints across the world. It was not necessary, then, for the church to have a visible head or even a specific institutional form, for it had an invisible head already, who was Jesus Christ. And all that was necessary then for Luther, for the true church to be manifest, was that the word of God be truly proclaimed and the sacraments be truly administered. So in the end, we wind up with a certain tension in Martin Luther's thought, and that's perfectly fine. Big ideas ran around in Luther's head, and he was never systematic enough. Maybe he really didn't believe in system enough to reduce everything and square it all up. But we will see this again as we move next week into the second half of our series. So, thank you very much.